really a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thanks for everyone who's attending. It's going to be, I think, an exciting panel where we talk about some of these pivotal issues that we don't only care about in the world of healthcare industry and manufacturing and policy, but also, as we know, it's well covered in the lay press and in the world of politics. So I think it's something of great interest. By way of introduction, we have Nick Crabb with us today, Program Director of Scientific Affairs, the Center for Health Technology Assessment at NICE in the UK. We also have Michael Fine, Medical Director of HealthNet of California. And we have Mark Trusheim, Founder and Director of CoBio Consulting, Executive in Residence at MIT Sloan School of Management. He's also a former special government employee, the FDA Officer of the Commissioner. So really excited about this esteemed panel who's going to weigh in on gene and cell therapy valuation. So without further ado, let's jump right in. You know, what's so exciting about this space is that there's so much promise, yet there's so much complexity and potential barriers as well as accelerators to market access. And what we're going to do in today's discussion is explore some of these factors. There's a number of stakeholders out there that have their own perception of value when it comes to cell and gene therapy. And it's really important as a manufacturer to be thoughtful about these different stakeholder perceptions. And if we just think about some of the stakeholders that are out there, you know, what's different about cell and gene therapy? Well, one thing we know is different is that payers and HTA bodies, generally speaking, like to look at precedent cases when they make their decisions. And there's a lack of an evidence base in terms of precedent cases, especially in gene therapy. And so there's a lot of uncertainty when making their decisions about coverage and reimbursement. We know that payers and providers also need to be very thoughtful about how does this new complex, innovative medicine fit into their clinical pathways. Increasingly, we know that they're being measured by quality, there's process metrics, there's outcome metrics, and they're being reimbursed in conjunction with those metrics. So they want to be thoughtful about adopting a new technology, such as a cell and gene therapy, in a way that's going to fit in their workflow. The same thing goes for labs. I mean, they have workflows that also need to be adapted and assimilated to accommodate cell and gene therapy. And the patients that are out there in the system, we all know that we're on a kind of a ride toward volume to value medicine, essentially more integration, both here as well as in the EU. But it's still a long way out in terms of achieving that optimal level of integration with good information sharing. So if you're a patient and you're suffering from one of these rare conditions or even some of the more prevalent conditions, there's a lack of integration. And so they need help navigating this system. And a lot of these manufacturers in this space are going to have a little bit more in their remit beyond just the product. They're going to have some wraparound services that assist in the navigation of the system. Could be something as straightforward as reimbursement and looking at copay and current coinsurance, but it could be a little bit more complicated because these patients, they are assuming more financial burden. They pay more out of pocket. Copay and coinsurance is going up. So that makes them more of a consumer than a patient these days. And so they ask a lot of questions. They're data hungry. And so it's important as manufacturers to be thoughtful about how do I follow these patients? How do I enable them to make better information-driven decisions with their providers about cell and gene therapy? Just drilling down now on the payer perspective, obviously that's the focus of today's panel. You know, there's been some interesting work done. You know, we know that in NICE in the UK, and Nick is going to comment on this in his discussion. I have a couple of questions of follow-up for him. But they did something very pioneering. They see this coming down the pike. They know it's complex medicine. So they said, let's run a hypothetical case for a CAR T therapy and just evaluate, does our methodology stand in this space? Does it work? Is it as valid and reliable in this cell and gene therapy space as compared to conventional medicine, let's say? And what they found in summary was that their methods would work, and they would apply to this type of medicine, and they could use the same types of evaluation that look at costs and benefits, as well as safety and effectiveness. And today we're going to explore a little bit more about that, find out a little bit more about the rationale, and see if that's going to stand as well for gene therapy. So that's going to be interesting to kind of dig in on this HTA assessment. Something else that comes up as a common theme is that in clinical development, we've been really trained to be regulator-oriented for very good reason. And so the probability of success is governed by that regulatory perspective. We're very thoughtful about comparators, duration of trial, any type of endpoint, subset analysis, risk factors. But all those variables I just mentioned increasingly need to be pressure tested with payers. There's a very formal pilot program going on in Europe right now where you could test some of these design features with different HTA assessment agencies to find out what they think about some of your design. And obviously, no agency, whether it be a regulator or a payer, is going to tell you what to do, but they can provide guidance with respect to how they are assessing products today with regard to different endpoints, comparator decisions, what the standard of care is. And so just like you meet with regulators and begin to pressure test your clinical trial design, it's important to do the same with HTA bodies as well as payers in the US. And I expect to hear from Michael a little bit more about that in the panel. One thing we also hear a little bit about, because we know that the cell and gene therapy most likely will carry premium pricing. And we know with the very few precedent cases, some of these prices have been extreme, up to $1 million. And so therefore, it's really precipitated a conversation around healthcare policy circles, as well as between payers and manufacturers, other panels I've moderated, in terms of really testing what could we do differently. If you look at the big healthcare system view, we're very well aware that there's alternative payment models in play today. And so can we actually adopt some of that thinking in the world of pharma and payer partnerships? And can some of these pay-for-performance deals be struck? We know that there's some regulatory and there's some policy barriers to achieving that success. I know right now there's discussions in DC about creating a safe harbor to allow for pharma companies to do these types of deals with hospitals and integrated delivery networks and payers, but it's going to take some time, and really there needs to be some proactive involvement on the manufacturer side to make it happen. The long story short on this slide was everybody thinks it's a good idea conceptually, but when you actually ask them, could you do it today, they say no, we would just pay a lump sum. But they do like the idea of maybe testing capped annuities, for instance, and mortgage-type payment financial mechanisms to actually weigh the value of the product with the effect of the product over a period of time. So in summary, it's important to take a healthcare systems view. And if you look at what's going on in the healthcare system in US and most of Europe today, there's this triple aim conversation of trying to enhance the quality of care for patients, achieve better population outcomes, and save money at the same time. And these are the levers we need to actuate to make that happen: efficiency, effectiveness, equity of care, and economics. So today, in this panel, we're going to explore some of these levers. How do we do it together? Payers and pharma companies working together to achieve that triple aim. So what I'd like to do now is open the panel. And, I like, maybe many of you watched some of the debate last night, so some ground rules would be don't talk over one another.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no insulting one another, well, at least while we're on the panel. And let's kind of keep it to the facts. I'm sure we'll have some fact-checking out there. So let's open with just a general policy question. I mean, what do you guys think? I made some points about what the future state could look like in terms of pay for performance, and we know these are premium price products. How are we actually going to devise a mechanism to pay for them? And we could just kind of go down the line, because this one's a macro question. So Nick.
Sure, thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, this really is a really big question. So I think the starting point for me is that we're in very, very exciting times with pipelines of products, especially in particular in the sort of ATMP space, that are suggestive of products that can really, really transform patient outcomes. So I think we do need to work sort of really hard to try to find solutions that work for all of the stakeholders, and in particular, the sort of patients who can really benefit from these products. I guess that's why we did the study, which I think you're going to ask me about later, so I won't say too much about that right now. But we think that sort of payment methods as well as pricing, and it's really important that we don't forget actual pricing, because there does need to be some sort of realism around what sort of prices different healthcare systems can actually afford. But pricing and payment methods are also going to be very important. And I agreed with the summary slides that you presented, John, that right now a lot of sort of payer organisations, including the NHS in England, would struggle actually implementing these sort of pay for performance type sort of methods. But I think it's something we need to really, really work on in collaboration with other stakeholders, very much including the industry.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And Michael, what do you think from the U.S. perspective? Can this actually happen in the private payer market?
Well, it's a bit of a challenge. I assume what you mean by pay for performance, and particularly for gene therapy, is that you would pay a certain amount every year for as long as the therapy was successful.
That's right.
And if it failed, then you would stop paying. The problem in the U.S. is that members, patients, are mobile. They go from plan to plan. And we have no easy way in the United States today to track them and to actually track their clinical outcomes. We've invested a huge amount of dollars, in billions and billions, in electronic medical records, and you would say, oh, well, that would be an easy way to do it. The problem is that there are probably 20 different formats, and none of them communicate with each other. And in fact, today, when we have to get information from hospitals or physicians, what they do is print it out and fax it to us. So there isn't a... So there isn't, and you can't, I used to say, when we used to get records, we used to get like 5 pages of illegible writing that we couldn't figure out what they were saying. Now we get 200 pages of perfectly typed writing, but we can't find what we're looking for. And so that's the real challenge, is how do you really track the patient, track the clinical outcomes, and then know as a payer whether you should keep paying for that service when the member's left your plan. And so I think that makes it problematic. I don't know, until we have a solution for that sort of pay for performance would work.
Thank you, Michael.
I think it can work, just to be a little controversial on this. But it comes down to creativity and cleverness of how you use the imperfect data sources that we have. And so as we do our clinical development programs, we have control over the data that we produce, what the clinical regimens are going to be, how we report that, even what we choose for our endpoints. But when you get out into the reimbursement space, we're now dependent on everybody else's data, which they collect for other reasons. And the art and the thoughtfulness has to be, what are the fewest number of data points that one can have to get an indication that the populations are roughly doing what you thought they were going to do. Not every patient every time. Express Scripts, if those of you who know in oncology, is starting to pay different rates for different oncology indications for the same therapeutic. And they don't track every patient. They say we know about how many are going into which specialty, or given what other codes are with them, we can figure out which type of cancer it is. And then they just do a weighted average of those things with very few data points. Is it perfect? Is it what I, as an MIT quant head in the economics department, would really want to see down at every little piece? No, it's terrible. But is it a lot better than just saying, oh, we'll give you the same price for everything and now argue about whether it's the low one or the high one? At least it's a step in those directions. But it has to be very thoughtful, and in fact, for the developers and the innovators making the proposals, it's really awkward because you don't have control over this data. And it's data you have to understand. You may not always have access to it, and you have to be highly creative in how you use it. It's very different than just, this is my clinical development plan, I have control, right. Let's go. It's a very different kind of creativity.
A lot of uncertainty in real-world data.
Yeah, it's more like a Monet painting as opposed to,
A bit more abstract.
Yeah.
Another follow-up question for you, Mark. I know that you track policy carefully. I've heard a lot of payers and pharma companies on panels such as this say, we want to do this, but there's not a safe harbor to do this type of work together, and something has to change in the regulatory landscape to allow for this type of deal making. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's really necessary. You've heard Nick already talk about some of this, and you did, John, as you brought forward. Europe has some formal programs now where you can get scientific advice, pre-advice that includes both payers and the regulators. The FDA now has a medical device program where they do that. There's talk that might spread into therapeutics as well. They actually did a couple therapeutics a number of years ago, but Congress got a little upset at everybody for that, so they didn't continue that, but I think it might come back. And then there's some private initiatives that happen. He gave me sort of a softball here. So MIT has the Center for Biomedical Innovation. We have a New Digs consortium where we hold these multi-stakeholder safe harbor discussions to look at case studies in the context of how they're both valuable for that case, but also more informative for general policy discussions. And it's not, we bring all the different stakeholders together from Europe, from the US, work through a particular case, look at the various potential options. It helps the development teams be much more thoughtful about moving forward, but it can also help open minds of the entire group about what could be possible or not, but they're not official negotiations in any way, and we make sure that there's no sense that there's any decision-making going on. So nothing's binding on anybody going forward from those, but they still can be very helpful, and NICE has a scientific advice process. A number of payers now have some ability to talk to people, although the rules and the laws make that sometimes very difficult, and hopefully those might change.
And Nick, maybe you could now weigh in from the NICE perspective and your experience with that advice process, and maybe then touch on this hypothetical appraisal exercise you guys conducted this spring.
Sure. I think one of the really key things is that there is an ability to have early discussions about these issues, because I think they're so complicated. Getting to them really early rather than just before market launch is really important. So we at NICE have had a scientific advice program for the last sort of 7 years or so, that's been very popular, and it's been taken up a lot, and it's evolved in a number of ways, including working with other HTA agencies and the European Medicines Agency on providing sort of parallel regulatory and HTA advice. Quite an important development recently was an understanding on our part that even though the scientific advice program is really, really important, people wanted to engage with us over a much broader range of issues than just sort of prospective clinical trial design. So about a year ago, we also opened the Office for Market Access, which is another sort of engagement opportunity, and very much building on the sort of work that Mark and colleagues has done, and also the EMA through its adaptive pathways pilots. We also offer sort of safe harbour discussions, although we tend to, or so far at least, they've focused more on the system in the UK rather than sort of more generally. I guess moving on to the regenerative medicine study, one thing we became aware of through an activity in the UK that was the regenerative medicine expert group that was sitting throughout sort of 2014, and they produced a report early in 2015. Was we sort of really became aware that this was a very, very important developing sort of area. And there were concerns as to whether our sort of methods and processes may or may not be applicable to this type of sort of advanced therapy. So rather than speculate too much, we thought we'd find out. So there was a recommendation in the Regenerative Medicine Expert Group report that we should do a study along the lines of the one that we did. And we sort of undertook that study in collaboration with researchers at the University of York. And it really was a very, very helpful exercise because it really allowed us, outside of the heat of a real technology appraisal, to probe a whole range of issues. And we sort of came up with this sort of hypothetical product, and we developed all these different scenarios, and those scenarios were probing the impact of maturity of evidence, as well as price, as well as payment sort of methods. Where we sort of got to was and I should say we presented these scenarios to an expert panel as well, which looked a bit like a technology appraisal committee, but wasn't a real committee. Where we got to was fundamentally there's no reason why the sort of cost utility analysis approach that we use at NICE and some other agencies use as well. There's no fundamental reason why it can't work for products of this type. But we did also identify some challenges that were particularly challenging. They weren't unique challenges, but they were particularly challenging for ATMPs. And these were around sort of understanding and presenting and managing uncertainty, and that's decision uncertainty. So we don't really know how good these products are, and we also sort of concluded that sort of payment methods might become very important. I think that the work we did is sort of fairly generalizable to situations where you've got a combination of products that appear to be offering major transformational benefits, but where we don't really fully know that, and where they're very expensive. And I think it's that sort of combination that's really tricky. And I think that combination is probably going to be encountered quite a bit in sort of cell and gene therapies.
Yeah, and just pivoting off of that, back in the U.S., Michael, when you think of the valuation frameworks and the advent of the ASCO framework and Memorial Sloan Kettering and ICER, do you see something similar taking form in the U.S. where these frameworks are going to specifically look at cell and gene therapy and determine if their methodologies are going to apply?
Well, I think that eventually will happen. But right now, really, this is just basically starting the discussion. I mean, these frameworks are interesting, but they're not actually applied at the present time. Maybe Sloan Kettering uses theirs for them, but it's not used really by payers, because really society as a whole has to decide, what are we going to pay for? How much value does a new medical technology have to have in order for it to be worth society paying for it? Because essentially we're all paying for that. Healthcare is something, we're all supposed to have insurance, and and we're all sharing in it. And so it needs to be a decision made by society, which means, the government to decide at what point we're going to say, this is really costing, $100,000 per life year, and it just is too expensive. We just can't afford it. And that we haven't done that, because that's a tough question, and that is something that has to be done by politicians with intelligent discourse, and we know that's an oxymoron now. And so I don't know. I mean, it's starting the discussion. I think it's important, but I see it being at least one election cycle away, and maybe further before we can actually start applying it in terms of making decisions about coverage.
Yeah. It's an interesting point you make, too, that you touch on this affordability issue, where we've been discussing the valuation to determine whether or not a product is valuable. And it could be deemed valuable, but not affordable. And so how do we get past that and begin to figure out, is it a minister of finance discussion, more of a minister of health discussion in terms of funding payers in a more meaningful way? Maybe, Mark, as a follow-up to that, with the healthcare landscape change in the U.S. and this move from volume to value and risk shifting and ACOs popping up, do you see a longer-term view from providers where they're more integrated and they're more apt to try something innovative in a payment scheme?
I think there's a lot of opportunity that they're interested in seeing things that are creative in the reimbursement side. But our experience of capitation in the 90s, for those of you who are old enough to have lived through that, is that when providers start taking risk, they actually become less open to new kinds of technologies going forward. And that's one reason capitation, frankly, fell apart, was they were more interested in saving costs than in providing better and new technologies and care through all that, amongst a number of other sorts of challenges that capitation had. So I think there's lots of opportunity for new reimbursement models, but we have to be careful not to get trapped in this triple aim idea. So triple aim basically says, we like today's health status, we want it cheaper, faster, better. Well, the whole point of all the products that we're producing in this category and this type is we're not happy with today's health status. We want to improve it. As an economist, as soon as you buy more, you should be willing to pay more for that. And in the 50s and 60s, most societies loved antibiotics. They loved all the new cardiovascular drugs. They wanted to pay more for healthcare. Today, we're finding Europe thinks they sort of like to pay, but they just economically can't. In the United States, we think we might be in the same position, but we haven't really believed that's the case yet, but you can sort of see it coming. So part of what I think we have to do, and you hinted at it, was differentiate between healthcare inflation and drug inflation, which is paying more for the same thing, and improving real health, which is you're paying more for new stuff. And you guys are mostly about paying more for new stuff, not about simply, we like the current health status, let's see if we can do it better and cheaper. And that's a very different public perception, and the public used to love that. Today, not so much. But I think you've got the inspiring stories that we have to get out there so that they're really happy that they're going to pay an extra 0.25% or 0.5% of GDP for all this benefit.
I'm going to switch gears and also just remind the audience this is interactive, so please, if you do have questions, just raise your hand. I think there's a roaming mic out there, and I'll be sure to call on you. But while you're formulating your questions, I have another sort of macro question for the panel. We know that there's been a lot of new policy and legislative options for accelerating approval. With conditional market authorization and adaptive pathways in Europe, and there's very similar parallel type of accelerated pathways in the US. Given this acceleration that we potentially assume cell and gene therapy have access to, what would that mean in terms of value demonstration to payers? Seemingly, they'll be looking at even a smaller evidence base. When the product is submitted to them for coverage determination, then what?
Want me to start?
Yeah, please, Nick.
Yeah, and I think perhaps the first place to start is as these sort of adaptive pathways evolve, is really making sure that there's close alignment between sort of payer organisations and the regulatory agencies. I think that's really quite important. And I would say that strong progress is being made there. So in Europe, the adaptive pathways pilots have been a very good example of sort of HTA agency and regulators working very well together. So I think that's a really important point, because if the regulators are focused on products that are genuinely impacting unmet medical need and stand a really good chance of very beneficially impacting that unmet need, then I think you create a very strong incentive all the way through the system to find ways of turning that sort of regulatory approval into access to the patients that need them. I think if the regulators are sort of, obviously they're only going to look at things that are clinically useful, but if they're too sort of permissive and sort of things with relatively small incremental benefit also go through those regulatory pathways, I think there is a real danger that HTA agencies will be faced with very incomplete data, something that looks quite interesting but not spectacular, and it's going to be very, very difficult. So I think that, so I guess my first point is let's really try to come together on what transformational means and apply these sort of pathways to products that really do look like they're going to be transformational. And having done that, I think for a start we'd then be looking at a reasonably small number of products, which is probably more feasible in terms of really working on sort of the managed access arrangements and innovative payment models. That there may be some sort of case for more realistic pricing in the early days while the evidence is low, so sort of ways of prices to also adapt as the evidence emerges. I think all of these sort of things are going to be quite important, and I do think that as long as we all work together, I think we will sort of solve these issues as long as we focus our efforts on areas where products really are addressing unmet need.
this coverage with evidence development concept is interesting. Seems like, Mark, you have a point of view here, and then
No,
Michael. Michael first.
Michael,
Well, I think Nick makes a very good point that those things that developed is what the FDA calls through breakthrough now really have to be breakthrough. They have to be transformative. I mean, somehow the fourth, PD-1 antibody to market shouldn't really have breakthrough status, in my opinion, yet it does. So the first thing we have to do is make it clear that you only get this rapid pathway if you're unique and if you really have a chance of significant benefit. The other problem with that is we have to then be willing to take it away if it really doesn't perform as advertised. A good example of this is, I think you all know what Avastin is. Obviously, it's an anti-VEGF, which was originally studied in breast cancer. Actually, that's where it started. It got approved with accelerated pathway. It got approved without any evidence that it extended life, but it got approved based on a conditional approval that the company had to demonstrate an overall survival benefit, or it would be removed. That FDA indication would be discontinued. Well, I don't know if you're all aware of what happened when the FDA finally, after years of evidence showing it was completely ineffective in breast cancer, finally admitted that. It took about, I think, a couple of years. You probably know better than I do how long, how many meetings it did.
Yeah.
And they finally said, this doesn't work. And then it was a battle to get physicians and patients to stop using it. Because everybody had
you would think would be saying thank you for not forcing me to use something that doesn't work.
Well, there were all these anecdotal stories of patients saying, I'm on Avastin and it's saving my life. Well, obviously, humans are very individual, and some things may or may not work in them, or they may be just doing well for reasons other than the drug. But we have the trouble in the U.S. of once we've offered something is to remove it. So those are two challenges. We need to be sure that it really truly is transformative, and that we're willing to say if it doesn't meet the expected endpoints, the expected outcomes, that we will no longer pay for it. And that's tough. But I think it's worth doing. I agree with Nick.
And so this comes back to being adaptive. You heard Nick use that term. The Europeans now use a term called adaptive pathways for a particular conditional approval approach, which really grew out of work we did at MIT with them and a bunch of stakeholders, which we called adaptive licensing at first. So it really grew out of that. And in the US, we call it accelerated approval, and you just heard the great story with Avastin. But we don't do it very well. We don't do this adaptiveness well. And there's this myth that these conditional approval approaches, these adaptive pathways, are a way to get to market fast and then stop. It's a quid pro quo. You get access to patients sooner. In return, manufacturers in the community develop evidence longer and more robustly. And the real advance as well with adaptive pathways is real-world evidence is now explicitly part of that evidence development package. And it tries to get negotiated up front with all the various stakeholders as to what are the thresholds, what should be the first approval, what's the additional evidence, what's the titration approach, that if the evidence proves high, medium, or low, does it get withdrawn or simply restricted to certain types of patients, and how does that continue on? These kind of adaptive ideas would seem to work really well with some of the adaptive reimbursement ideas we're talking about for these kinds of products. That is, the evidence develops, that the reimbursement and the coverage develops with them, for better, we hope, or for worse, unfortunately, for those that biology just didn't really pan out in a broader population. But it still might work for some, and we shouldn't withdraw it from the some for whom it works. It just won't get broader than that. And particularly for very small population drugs, this is even more critical so that we maintain credibility. One of the great risks, I think, for us is approving things so quickly and paying for them, and then if they don't pan out and we don't withdraw them in an orderly and very above-board way that everyone's in agreement with, this field's going to start looking like nutrition supplements, right? Who believes what about what on any of the nutrition claims and the weight-building things, right? We can't let this field go in that direction. Yeah. It has to be based on this kind of evidence, but it can adapt and it can evolve over time. And that's what I think these pathways, the regulators are trying to put up. But the payers, at this point, for many reasons, and the manufacturers haven't been able to coordinate that as well. Some of them are legal reasons that we have to solve.
I mean, it's fascinating. Your collective point of view on this seems to say to me that we're talking about evidence generation from a regulatory standpoint, and there might be a mandate to collect some safety data if there's a conditional approval, but it also could be applied for value demonstration. So there could be multiple applications of the real-world evidence that really needs to be generated.
Right, and in oncology, that can be real-world evidence for even new indications over time, right?
Questions from the audience so far?
Yes, my name is Kevin Scrutch. I'm with Allosource. To this kind of evidence, and mostly towards Dr. Fine, I appreciate that society needs to decide kind of what they want to pay for, but frankly, from a more pragmatic standpoint, if I'm CFO or CEO of HealthNet, and there's a technology out there that can give me an advantage, perhaps it saves lives, perhaps it positions me better with my competitors, or it's less costly, I would want to know about that, as quickly as I could. So my question is, in your experience, have you had technologies which attracted your attention, that the profile was good enough that you would want to add to your portfolio of patient care? And if not, what would the profile of a technology look like that would attract you and get your attention that you would want to implement as quickly as you could?
Okay, I mean, I think there are, two answers to that. Every once in a while, a new therapy comes along that really is cost savings. An example of that is low molecular weight heparins. I mean, when they were studied, and they were, we had warfarin, which was, I think, about 2 cents a tablet. And then and so a whole course of therapy was probably about $3. And then we got these new transformative medications that were like $600 for a course of therapy. So we had taken the price, I don't know how many percentage above, but but when we looked at the data, and everybody looked at the data, the savings that were achieved, because it was so much more superior in terms of preventing, leg clots and pulmonary emboli and bleeding and other complications, saved more money than the higher cost of the drug. So that's something that, we said, when we first had that, we were kind of reluctant. We had a prior authorization. You had to use warfarin first. We started looking at this. We started giving the stuff away because it was so much better than what we had today. The problem is, there's new technology which really helps, a part of the subpopulation do better, live longer, live a better life. The problem payers have is that if you're the first one that covers that, we have what we call adverse selection. Patients can move from plan to plan. And, the one thing you don't want to inherit is all the people with the severe rare disease, and you're the only one covering the therapy for that, because that puts you out of business real quick. I remember when some of these new targeted oncology therapies were, being developed, and we covered them because, we felt they were better, and we covered them with practically no restrictions, other than they just met the label indication. And our CEO called up and said, "What are you guys doing down there in medical affairs? We're going to get every person with lung cancer in California is going to sign up for our plan." So that's the problem. You kind of have to worry about adverse selection when you're maybe benefiting your members, but you're going to everybody who's going to be attracted to the one plan that's covering this transformative therapy and the others aren't.
So let's talk about the patient perspective. You mentioned a couple of times. We know in the U.S. that there's an increasing burden on the patient due to copay and multiple tiers and sometimes coinsurance. There's an expectation that they're going to participate more in their healthcare decision making. How do you see that impacting the adoption of cell and gene therapy?
Well, that's mostly been removed. I mean, the Affordable Care Act, for good or for bad, has removed, for the most part, patient participation in expensive therapies, not in basic therapies. I mean, there's no question that the plan designs today, which have a much higher patient share of cost for basic care, do reduce a lot of care. Whether it's necessary or unnecessary, we can argue about. But that's simple things like going in the emergency department, when you have a bad sore throat or something like that. When you're dealing with the therapies the audience is developing, these are very, very expensive, and the amount that patients have to pay now is capped. Under the Affordable Care Act, presently it's $6,250. Well, that's a lot of money. But if you've got a gene therapy and you've got hemophilia, and you're going to basically be cured or maybe at least off therapy for years, that's not a lot of money. So patients are not going to, the good thing is patients are not going to be, refusing these transformative therapies because they can't afford them. Because the answer today is you can. That's one thing we have prevented in this country is from everybody going bankrupt every time they had a serious disease. And so it's good. That's a very positive thing. But on the other hand, everybody's going to want it because it's going to not cost them that much money.
Mark, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, well, medical costs still account for 35% of personal bankruptcies in the United States as of a year or two ago.
Down from 60% or something.
Still 30% of all personal bankruptcies are due to medical costs. And it's not because of the $6,000. It's because of all the other out-of-pocket costs that don't get covered. So if I have to go to a medical center for a transplant and I have to have one of my caregivers give up their job for all that to be with me through that period, there's all these secondary costs that aren't technically covered by healthcare, but for many of the products which are being produced by you in this room are going to be real patient burdens. Now and that'll be a one-period hit, but it can be a very significant burden, right, to that, to going forward with that treatment. There are financing options that one could imagine that could be pretty easy. One of my colleagues, Andy Lowe at MIT, who's written a paper, gotten a lot of press in various places about healthcare mortgages, sorts of things, right? And that can work for many types of patients, but not all. You still have to qualify for getting the mortgage. And if you're disabled and you have terrible credit history and all these sorts of things, not clear that would work. But there may be other nonprofit ways to provide that kind of payment spread and other things. So as we think about these creative financing approaches, the point I would simply make is, yeah, the patients are much better under Obamacare sorts of new national rules if they hold up over time. But there's still real burdens there. And as we talk about these financing, it's not just between manufacturer and payer. You may also want to consider what's the right patient mechanism as well to qualify for spreading their payments out over 5 or 10 years like a car loan. Because for most people making $40,000, $50,000 a year, which is average household income, $6,000 is 10% and they're living paycheck to paycheck. That's still a lot of money.
Yeah. Holding cost constant then for a moment, Nick, turning to you. NICE has been proactive. I know in rare disease, for instance, you created a multi-criteria decision analysis algorithm that takes into account the patient perspective and how patients weigh benefits and risks. And Michael talked about every human being an individual. So what would you have to say about the patient perspective with regard to cell and gene therapy?
Well, we do have a special program for sort of ultra-orphan diseases, which I think is one that you're referring to. That's called our highly specialized sort of technologies sort of program, and that's really a special set of arrangements that acknowledge the sort of the rarity of the condition. But we do try to take account of the sort of patient voice as much as possible in all of our programs. So there's a very active program of engaging with patients and patient organizations, and in all of our programs there are opportunities for evidence from patients. I guess in a lot of our programs though we do apply cost per quality adjusted life year criteria in our decision making, and a lot of the other considerations can become absolutely critical in decision making where that sort of cost per quality is broadly in the right range. So these other sort of issues become really important, and the sort of patient perspective being a really key one. But in situations where the cost per quality is way outside of our range, then normally they would consider to not be cost effective, not affordable, and therefore they wouldn't be recommended.
And when you drill down on that a moment, so let's just play out a scenario if a cell and gene therapy candidate was suffering from a high morbidity disease, and they are potentially more risk tolerant than an average patient suffering from something less serious. Could you foresee a future state in assessing technologies that quantitatively takes into account a patient's risk-benefit valuation scheme when you evaluate these technologies?
Well, yeah. I guess it's important to remember that the actual, the base methodology that we use is in determining the sort of, quality of life dimensions of cost per quality, then a great deal of that sort of evidence is actually based on outcomes that have been reported by patients in the clinical trials. So I think it's really important that we don't forget that the actual sort of patient experience is actually built in to the sort of quantitative analysis that we do. But I think in addition to that, other sort of patient evidence that gets submitted as part of the process is sort of very much taken into account. And I acknowledge that we always need to be doing more and trying ever harder to really make sure that the decision-making processes really reflect things that are of key value to patients.
Michael, how about in the U.S., patient advocacy groups? Do you see them playing a central role in influencing coverage and reimbursement for cell and gene therapy?
Well, in some disease states, patient advocacy groups have been fairly effective. They're usually effective through the legislature, not directly on the plans, but it is effective. They get bills passed that cover a specific therapy for that disease. I don't think that's a kind of good way to assess, the quality of new transformative therapies, who has the strongest and loudest advocacy group and spends the most lobbying dollars. But they are effective in that way, and they do get things done. Again, primarily through legislation, and I understand that, sure. If you've got a family member or child that has that disease, you want to be a strong advocate. But again, I think it's probably not a very objective way to assess it.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, up front.
Excuse me, I don't have a mic. Marcus Peters from Molecular Consulting. Thank you. Marcus Peters from Molecular Consulting. It seems that in the gene and gel therapy space, there's a high level of complexity in the manufacturing process. Have you, from the payer side, looked at that, and are there any thoughts or consequences you would draw from that high level of complexity?
Value-based, you don't care. Right? Now, if you want to go to a cost-plus reimbursement approach, then it matters. But most of you don't seem to want to do a cost-plus approach, so it doesn't matter.
I think that's a good statement. I agree. Nobody has ever, and I've met with a lot of companies, drug companies, device companies, even some of yours, and nobody's ever actually shown me a justification for where they got their price, which in today it's basically obviously whatever they choose, but nobody designs something that shows, okay, this is how much it costs us to produce our cell or gene therapy, this is how much the research and development was, and this is how much we feel we should make in profit. So I think that's a fair system. It's probably a good system when you're dealing with a kind of monopoly product where there's only one and there's no competition, and so there's no way of really fixing a market price. But we haven't done that. I think we should, and I think you should, but we haven't done it to date.
I pretty much agree with Mark and Michael, except I'd also add that I think it's really important that when sort of contemplating developing a very sort of complex technology, just really making sure that it really is going to be adding so much benefit by addressing the unmet need that it's that it really will justify the sort of pricing that's necessary for that type of product, given the way in which sort of payer organisations value these things. And certainly in our case, we've got a very transparent system for how we go about assessing value, and something that's very expensive because it has to be very expensive because of the complexity of the product is going to be fine if it really is addressing unmet need in adding lots and lots of quality of life and years of life. But clearly, if it's just adding a small marginal benefit across against current standard of care, then it's just not going to work at premium pricing.
As a corollary to that, and I think I know the answer to the question from your perspective, Nick, given the exercise earlier this spring, but will being a cell and gene therapy fundamentally be an attribute that's considered when assessing coverage and reimbursement, or is it really more of a function of the indication, the prevalence, the morbidity, the mortality, the therapeutic options, level of unmet medical need? Is it also about the actual innovation, if you will?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I've been out of medical school for decades, but things haven't much changed. I remember I didn't go into surgery. I went into internal medicine, geriatric medicine, because I thought that was more challenging and interesting. But my surgeon friends always reminded me that a chance to cut is a chance to cure. And on the medical side, other than infectious diseases, we haven't really cured much over the 40-plus years that I've left. And so now, finally, we have an opportunity to potentially cure a lot of these diseases, or at least arrest progression that we haven't managed to do in the last 40 years of medical science. And so I think it's exciting. And it has the opportunity, if they really work well, to potentially reduce costs as well, because taking care of these patients are oftentimes very, very expensive. So this is really, outside of infectious disease, the first time in at least my lifetime, and I think in the last 100 years of medical science, that we're really going to potentially start curing, hopefully, a lot of these chronic diseases.
Mark, what do you think? Is this a special value attribute, being a cell and gene therapy?
So the economist in me says no. Mm-hmm. All right. But if you look at the processes that I've observed in Europe, many of the HTA processes talk about innovation as one of the little checkpoints that you get. And it's like extra credit, if you will, at the end, right? You still have to sort of score at the basic level. You have to get something over a D before you can get into the marketplace. But the innovation side, they do give you some extra points and will go up. The challenge there is their price levels are often pretty low, and therefore even getting those sorts of price levels aren't always satisfactory. But yeah, there are some of those formal frameworks have innovation as one of the things that you actually will get a premium on your pricing for. It will go into the HTA and make it more effective.
And even though you say you know my answer, and I think you do know my answer, I think in some ways we're sort of agnostic to the nature of the technology, but at the same time I think what we all want are really effective medicines getting to patients, and I think we are genuinely excited at the developments that are happening in the cell and gene therapy area, because they offer the potential for such transformational benefits, and where they do, we think that our sort of framework can adequately value that.
Thank you for that, Nick. And maybe just with the remaining few minutes, we could just, each one of you could take a shot at making some recommendations to the audience. These are generally manufacturers with a lot of products in development. There's still a lot of decision-making going on with regard to clinical development planning and now market access planning. If you had just a couple of minutes to make some recommendations to them, what would it be? We could start with you, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main advice from me would be to make sure that you're talking with HTA and payer organisations from a very, very early stage, so this can really be planned in. And I think the payer organisations and HTA agencies also need to get really good at their horizon scanning, so they're not taken by surprise either with things that are coming through. And I guess based on the study that we did at NICE. a particular area that I think we need to work on are these sort of more innovative payment methods that are going to allow us to sort of achieve patient access by fairly sharing risks. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in the sort of healthcare systems themselves, as well as in collaboration with industry, to make that happen. So that's pretty much top of my list at the moment.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to have early discussions with both payers and providers to know for sure what they value. And I think it's important to see what outcomes they expect from your products. I mean, that I think is oftentimes the greatest disconnect between payers and manufacturers is the outcomes we want to see are not oftentimes the outcomes that are studied. And that results oftentimes in a negative coverage decision because we don't see those outcomes. So I think it's very important. The other real challenge, I think, is for those real transformative therapies that offer long-term benefit is, how do you kind of produce enough evidence that you convince people that, the therapy that you say is going to work for 10 years is really going to work for 10 years. And I think that requires a lot of collaboration with, experts, like Mark and Nick, to say that, and have to independently assess that the models you're producing that are predicting this long-term benefit, they're really believable and they're really validated by independent organizations.
And Mark?
So I'm an MIT guy, so I'm going to come down on the side of data, right, for all this. But the data has to be, as Michael and Nick have said, we focus so much on what's the clinical development data we need to get for an initial regulatory approval. But in this new adaptive biomedical approach that we're talking about, you need to consider, I think, how are you going to create the evidence you need prospectively before you get to market, so you can go to people like Michael and say, this is what we know today, this is what we're going to know in the future, this is in fact our path for getting there, and we need access to some of your data to do that, because we want to look at some of your claims data rather than run clinical trials of every one of your patients, right? We just need some population data. Having that plan, spending as much time thinking about that ongoing evidence development over the time periods that we're talking about in a clever way, spending time on that, just like we do our clinical development pre-authorization stuff, and doing that early so you can actually get your products to your patients, I think, is the crux of all this. Yeah. It comes down to evidence and a long-term view of that evidence.
It's a very holistic definition of value.
Well, that's what we're asking to get reimbursed for, right? And the bigger the gap is between our clinical trial endpoints and the value we think we're going to ultimately provide patients, we got to show a way we're going to develop that evidence over time. Otherwise, you're only going to get paid for the evidence you've shown in your clinical trials.
Well, with that remark, I think we'll close the panel. And I want to thank the audience for your attention, your engagement, and especially our panelists for their expert insights. Thank you very much.